revolution starting inside. An instrumental part of Agora worldwide. Agora worldwide. Agora worldwide. Counter economics. Agorist strip. Black market click. Move a quick flip. Can't regulate this. Agorist strip. Black market click. Move a quick flip. Can't regulate this. Agorist. 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 Nexus. Agorist. Agorist.
It's the Agorist Nexus podcast. I'm Brandon. I've got my great co-host Dag. How you doing, Dag?
I'm doing excellent, buddy. How you doing?
Hey, pretty good. Loving life. We've got a really exciting guest on, Patrick Newman. But before we get into it, we've got a shout out to our sponsor, Presearch, great decentralized search engine. Or cryptos you search. It's kind of a no-brainer. So you might as well get something back for searching, and they've had a lot of upgrades recently, which has just made the user interface and everything just really nice. So
I actually just got a new Android phone, and I'm actually able to set it as a default browser and everything on my phone. I know it was just supposed to be like Europe, but I was able to do it on my phone. So, your results may vary, but it's really easy to use too. So anyhow,
that's cool. Which brand is it? I'm sorry.
It's a Galaxy S. It's the Galaxy S. I don't know, 21 plus or what. There's the first smartphone I ever had was a Galaxy S, and I've tried a cheaper phone, and I just can't. I'm not like a phone snob. I don't know. I just need to do certain things. I'm comfortable with it. Is what I use. But anyhow,
make sure you guys click our affiliate link so that they know that we're worth sponsoring. But with that said,
we have.
Go ahead, Dag. Sorry.
Yeah, no, all good. We have very special guests with us, like Brandon said, Patrick Newman. Patrick is a professor of econ at Florida Southern College. In Florida, he edited Conceived in Liberty, Volume 5, and The Progressive Era by Murray Rothbard. And we're going to talk about how he managed to get that done. He is also the author of a new book called Cronyism, which will be released next month, if I'm not mistaken. So with that said, Patrick Newman, thank you so much for coming, man. How you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me on. I'm happy to talk about Rothbard and as well as my own work.
Absolutely. So when the first I knew you existed, I had just picked up The Progressive Era by Rothbard and settled in to start reading it. And, reading the introduction, and it said, that you had edited it and you were a professor at Florida Southern in Lakeland, Florida. And at the time, I worked in Lakeland, Florida. I was in Lakeland, Florida, and I went, holy shit. And, I looked around to tell one of my coworkers how excited I was, that the dude who put this book together was in Lakeland. And then I quickly, of course, remembered that nobody else cares, about Austrian economics in, my normal life. So, I just had to keep that one to myself. But that was pretty cool, man. So, why don't you maybe tell us a little bit about how those books came into being? I mean, they were published posthumously. How did that happen?
Sure. So I edited I've edited Murray Rothbard's Progressive Era. That book came out in 2017, and then I edited the 5th volume of Conceived in Liberty Volume 5, The New Republic, 1784 to 1791. That book came out in 2019. It all started I was a summer fellow at the Mises Institute in 2012 and 2013. And in 2013, I started to work in the Rothbard archives, where Rothbard's private letters, manuscript, correspondence, etc., is housed at the Institute. So, of course, Rothbard died in 1995, so he was a man who never went on the internet. He typed everything, snail mail, used the typewriter, etc., and so you're able to see in physical form all of his letters and manuscripts, things that he had published, things that he hadn't published, and so on. I started off with the Progressive Era. I had looked at the manuscript, the unfinished book Rothbard wrote in the 1970s while he was with the Cato Institute. It was actually a big part of his split with that institute. I guess that's a story for another time, though. And I was always very interested in American history. That's part of what my dissertation that I was working on at the time, what that was related to. And I basically was able to type up the Rothbard manuscript and combine it with some later published essays of his, provide footnotes, clean up the grammar a little bit, just do minor crossing T's, dotting the I's, so to speak. So I worked on that book in the summer of 2016 and in the summer of 2017. And the book came out at the Mises Institute Supporter Summit in New York City of 2017. That was a big undertaking. It was a lot of work. It was manageable, mainly because a lot of what Rothbard had written was typed. So the projects got harder as they went along, because after the Progressive Era, I wanted to try and tackle the manuscript of Rothbard's fifth volume of Conceived in Liberty. So this is a much more involved project because Rothbard had handwrote the entire volume. The original plan in the 1960s, when Rothbard was working on it, when he had a research grant to work on it, was that he would handwrite the book and someone else, a professional typist, would type it. So Rothbard would handwrite it, he would record it into a dictating machine, and then someone would listen to it and type it all out. You know, these are in the days of typewriters, so it could be cumbersome to type something out. Rothbard's research interests changed. His research grant ended. He was only able to publish the first 4 volumes. And when he tried to publish the 5th volume or return to it in the early 80s, the recording machine had broke and he was stuck with his massive 400 pages of handwritten notes, handwritten really manuscript. So then Rothbard kind of dropped the project. He worked on other things. He always wanted to return to it, but he died. And that's where the manuscript basically laid. The issue is that Rothbard's handwriting is very messy. If you've ever seen it in some of his books at the Mises Institute or a couple pictures of it online, you'll know what I'm talking about. His wife, Joanne, tried to read the manuscript in the 1990s. She couldn't do it. No one else could do it. So it basically just sat in the Rothbard archives as sort of a, hey, here's the 5th volume, but no one can read it. So I really tried to learn the language of Rothbardinese, so to speak. I have a very messy handwriting. I was able to decipher it, and I went through the painstaking process of literally translating the pages. This was in the summer of 2018, also partially in the summer of 2019. I was able to do so. So then the book came out in the fall of 2019 at the Mises Institute Supporter Summit in Los Angeles. So I was able to basically, through my connection with the Mises Institute and the Rothbard archives, really tackle these 2 projects that Rothbard never had a chance to return to because he unexpectedly died in his late 60s.
You were telling me that you got a little bit of like a break, like you found like a key that really helped you out in that translation process, right?
Yeah, it's sort of my Rosetta Stone. So one of the things one of the things that helped is that in his handwritten pages, Rothbard would occasionally, actually extensively in some cases, quote from either the Constitutional Convention, or he would quote from various secondary sources, books that he would cite, etc. So I was able to, if you type in a couple of words in quotes on Google or another search engine, etc., or if you've got an entire PDF of the notes of the Constitutional Convention, you can find out what Rothbard was talking about, and you could also see what the other words were. So this not only helped with the quotes, but what it also did is it helped with other writing that Rothbard he didn't quote someone else. It was just his own words, because you can kind of see how he actually formed his letters. Oh, so that's how he writes his G's, his S's, and so on. So you really kind of had a cheat sheet that you were able to build up and sort of almost get an alphabet. Because Rothbard, he was a very messy writer. It was written in sort of the sprawling cursive, and he would sometimes abbreviate words. He would abbreviate Pennsylvania. He'd put PA. He wouldn't always write the word and. He would put a plus sign, and so on. A lot of shorthand things that I had to learn. That's what he was doing. But a big help was the ability to search online and look at various books, the quotes that he was referring to, because that kind of gave a cheat sheet, if you will.
And that's really cool. It sounds like, I mean, I say it sounds like a lot of fun. I'm sure it was a ton of work and very like tedious, but like as someone who likes kind of solving puzzles, like that's pretty cool, man. It's really neat that you got the opportunity to do that. Like, I mean, how did it feel? Like, I mean, you were kind of like the first person to get to read some of this stuff. Really, I mean, how did that feel?
It was a great feeling. It definitely was tough work, but it was worth it. I was very close to throwing in the towel at the beginning of the project when, after 2 days, I had mainly gotten 3 sentences of translation. I said, okay, this is going to take me a lifetime, something of that nature. But I was able to learn more later in the week, and then I spent a lot of time on weekends working on this in the summer of 2018. Yeah, it was a big accomplishment. A lot of the fun or the thrill was sort of discovering, or like you said, reading Rothbard's words that no one else except him, that he had written decades ago. So he was writing this, both works in the 60s and the 70s, and there's still about historical episodes. So it has a lot of relevance to today and other current events and so on. And it was just very interesting. It felt very privileged to be able to do so. And it's the same not only with those manuscripts, but also with some of his private letters. He could be quite funny in his private letters. And you're like a kid in a candy store when you're in the Rothbard archives, basically, because you're always just finding something new. And you get to just see his own internal perspective, his private views on something, or what he thought about the Constitution, and all this stuff that now other people can read that no one else might have been able to read if someone hadn't gone through the work of basically translating and typing up both books.
So at the Mises Institute, they actually have like his personal collection of books and stuff, right? Like with like his like notes and the margins and everything.
Yes. So the Mises Institute is they have all of his books. They have his library of, I want to say it's about 6,000, 7,000 books, something around that number. So quite a lot. They also have all of his private letters, etc., and so forth. So really, the Mises Institute has all of Rothbard's his own intellectual property, so to speak, not in the intellectual. Most people hear intellectual property, think of something else. I just mean all of his belongings that related to his intellectual career in his writings. All of that's at the Mises Institute.
So I'm just laughing about like that term. So it's not intellectual property like we typically mean it, but his property that had an intellectual kind of lean to it, you know?
Yeah, I realized that came out. So it's a good IP. I guess we'll put it that way.
Yeah, so I mean, it's like yeah, I mean, it works linguistically. It's just not typically, you know, what you expect from that phrase. Oh yeah. Shit, you know, it's funny because we have, you know, in the, you know, a lot, so we all do to some extent, but especially in like the Liberty community, you know, we have our quote unquote heroes, and for most of us, Rothbard ranks up there, you know, so getting to sort of get some new stuff out of them after they pass and getting to preserve everything that is just available to be able to be preserved by them and open it up to where other people can enjoy it. You know, that's really neat, man. That's really a great undertaking, and I definitely applaud you for it. You know, we, you know, we're big fans of Conkin around here. You know, Samuel Edward Conkin III, I'm sure you're familiar. But a friend of the show, Victor Coman, he's actually been doing a lot of like archiving a lot of his old stuff and a lot of his, you know, the old New Libertarian newsletter and things like that, and putting them into an easy to find place. And it's just great because it's stuff that otherwise, you know, would have been lost. To, you know, making it available to future generations to learn from and enjoy. So man, that's really great.
Thanks. I appreciate that.
Sure.
One thing I was just gonna mention. It's funny you talk about archives. Is that I actually don't know what will happen in the future, because as we move increasingly to a digital economy, I don't know how you'll be able to do something of this nature for someone who most of their correspondence is through email or even texts, social media, whatever, etc. When you have everything printed out, it's actually fairly easy to search and digest a lot of someone's writings. So it's an archive it's solely becoming obsolete in a sense, or outdated. So it's very cool. It's a blast from the past to be able to look at old writings and show their relevance for today.
It's a really good point because like I could make the argument that like we're the most like documented generation in history, right? But it's like because everything is like, but like you said, like whether you just scroll through all someone's old texts, like they might, good luck finding them, after some point, or what's the future you? What would you just be scrolling through Rothbard's Instagram for just forever to try to find something good, at the least, it definitely sounds less magical than having paper in hand.
Right, exactly. It'll be interesting to see what will happen in the future. Maybe robots will do it.
Hey, yeah, they got that whole AI thing, so yeah, probably. We were talking about phones a minute ago, and it's totally off topic, but like my new phone, like when I point my camera at something, like if it's a car, it comes up as like a car, like it knows it's a car, and like it knows something's a tree, and it knows like it's weird, man. It is getting. It's one of those things. AI is one of those things. It's like, man, I love the promise of the really cool stuff that can be done with it, that can make my life better and easier. But damn, if it isn't creepy as hell too,
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Who knows? Who knows what'll be in store? Maybe the machines will rise up and kill us all.
Possible. So man, I really loved. I haven't read the Conceived in Liberty series yet, but I really loved the Progressive Era, and it, for listeners who might not be aware, it kind of goes to like the end of the Civil War to basically like the beginning of the Great Depression, and just especially after reading some of your book, it's I really don't know when to say is the biggest progression of the progressive kind of movement. I hate the alliteration there, but in that time period, it is very pronounced, and it's something that we all kind of know anyhow. But when you really just sort of read like the history of like laws and who benefits and whatnot, you really start to look at anytime there's a regulation, anytime there's a law, anything like that. It's like, okay, here's their stated goal, which is always something nice and cheery and supposed to be good for everybody. But it's like, where does you really just start to notice, okay, well, you look who benefits. And of course, it's always somebody who's lobbying or what have you. And that book's just one of those that really paints the picture. And I think one of the reasons that one is really effective too is because it's, it's like modern age. It's all the modern stuff we deal with, because for the most part, it's been the last 150 years, but it really just makes you see the world, differently when you start to realize that kind of thing. And it sort of seems like your new book is going to be, it's kind of like Conceived in Liberty and the same vein as the Progressive Era, but not written about that time. You really talk about how, the mix of, government and private industry. And in your book, you go between 1600 and basically like 1850. So you're doing the section of time before that. It looks like we're jumping over the Civil War, which of course has its own cronyist things and everything. And actually, on that note, you mentioned in the beginning of your book Jeffrey Rogers Hummel or Hummel. I'm not sure which one of those pronunciations is accurate. But I would recommend to fill in those gaps. The Civil War, emancipating slaves, enslaving free men, for anybody listening who does want to fill that gap in, because I really enjoyed that book, and I'm a big fan of Jeffrey Hummel. Have you worked with him?
Yeah, so I email him actually frequently. He emailed me last week. I've spoken with him. So Jeff Hummel, he's a good guy, and the book, as you've mentioned, my book Cronyism is kind of sandwiched in between Conceived in Liberty Volume 5 and the Progressive Era. I would like to continue the story into the Civil War, like through the Civil War, and really kind of covering the material of Rothbard's Progressive Era and beyond. But that was just simply too much to do in a book in the detail I wanted to do it in. So I have to leave it for something else. But yeah, so Jeff Hummel's book, Emancipating Slaves, Enslaving Free Men, is a great analysis of the Civil War.
Well, and I like it because it's not like I'm not a huge military history guy, but like I'm an economics nerd. So like that, like it's not giving you like, oh, and then at the Battle of Bull Run, like this and that, it's a lot more. Here's the economics behind a lot of it, and they say things like, hey, you learn really a lot of the terrible things both sides did as far as like printing money and nonsense like that, but it kind of makes you think about the profitability of slavery in a little bit different way too, which is kind of interesting. I don't want to get too much into that, but it is It is interesting, and you touch a little bit on that in your book as well. When it's one of those things. It's like if it's not subsidized by the government and there's not a protection racket going on, it's just not as appealing of an institution. There's not as much, if any, profit to be had there. But I'm sorry, I gotta be careful talking about like slavery and stuff. I don't want to get too controversial there.
No, it's fine. Yeah, the slavery discussion is fascinating. I do spend a lot of time in my book talking about the special interest privileges surrounding slavery, regarding slave patrols and basically like the fugitive slave clause, et cetera, et cetera. And that's something Jeff Hummel does as well, because a lot of people just assume that the free market was it somehow caused slavery, or that the only way to get rid of slavery in the United States was this really long and costly civil war. And as Jeff Hummel has mentioned, as well as what I would like to do if I could write a book on the subject, is that actually if you got rid of the regulations and the South seceded, the institution would have died out within a pretty short period of time, or at least the economic tendencies point to that. But slavery, just like tariffs, currency, land speculation, et cetera, was just another industry where there are people who are searching for crony special privileges.
Hey guys, quick pause here to tell you about our sponsor, Devault Cryptocurrency. Ticker symbol DVT is a low cap coin with a market cap around 900,000. So there could be room for opportunity here. Not financial advice, but we really like this project.
Yeah, the Devault core wallet is one of the best I've ever seen. Very user-friendly, super easy to use with cold staking rewards, so it's like getting interest. They're working on privacy with Terraform, also DeFi to decentralize and replace financial institutions.
So go ahead and check them out over at devault.cc and get you a Devault core wallet today. Also, be sure to check out the show notes to find exchanges that they are traded on. With that said, let's get back to the show.
Yeah, for sure. So, cronyism in government, obviously it's horribly rampant. I mean, it is basically government, and, let's try to step outside of my, anarchist brain and just think about things, we're like, okay, let's say I wanted to design a government. It's going to be good and it's going to be for everybody, good, blah, blah, blah. I can't. And I start to think about a specific issue or problem. How would I solve that? And there's just no way to do it that isn't somehow cronyist. And even if you have the best intentions, okay, I need a service for the city and whatever. Well, my friend Joe, let's say it's to mow the lawn at City Hall, right? Whatever. Well, my friend Joe has a lawn care company and I know he's a good guy and I know he'd do a good job. So I'll have the city hire him. Obviously, the problem, just like with any, government thing, is the people paying for it don't have the choice and blah, blah, blah. And you might be making the best decision. Maybe your friend Joe is the best person for it, but it's still somebody getting special treatment and government favors. And even if it's not malicious, it's just still the way things go. It just seems like there's no way to avoid that, when having a government.
Oh, yeah. I mentioned this in my introduction, that cronyism is built into government power. I mean, it's based off the fact that when the government intervenes, it's benefiting one group at the expense of someone else. This is different than exchange, which is voluntary exchange, which is mutually beneficial. So if the government is to privilege some person to mow lawns, well, then they're going to use taxpayer money. It's going to hurt other people to benefit that one company. That company is going to get a subsidy compared to other lawn mowing agencies and so on. So even with the best intentions, or at least the best stated intentions, government legislation, government regulation virtually always devolves into some sort of redistribution or favoritism.
Yeah, there's cases of this that are wide open in real life currently, that it just blows my mind that more people don't come to this conclusion that everything government does is a cronyist thing. But one of the big ones in Florida a few years ago was back when Rick Scott was our governor, and he was trying to implement drug testing for welfare recipients. And fairly made about that, but the company that he was going to have do the drug testing was owned by his wife. So it's quickly it's well, even if you had a good reason for, drug testing welfare recipients, you are going to make bank off of this, or his wife is, and it's just so obvious all the time, man. It's, it's tough. And then of course, lobbying is just, I mean, it's a business, definitely. I think it was one of Tom DeLorenzo's books about Lincoln. He was saying the name lobbying actually came from because they wait in the lobby to to talk to the president and get their cut, get whatever they were hawking, get their cronies.
Yeah.
benefits.
So in the British term originates when in the lobby of the parliament, businesses would wait for politicians to enter, and they would try and talk to them before they went into the legislature. So that's the term, the original term, lobbying. People argue that as you mentioned, the American, it became popular American usage because President Ulysses S. Grant in the late 1860s and 1870s would often go to a hotel across the street from the White House and drink whiskey and smoke cigars and everything and hang out in the hotel lobby. And people would go to the lobby, businesses and other interests, and try and schmooze with the president and get some favorable government contract or job or whatever. Yeah, so it's heavily built into the levers of government. Cronyism.
So you talk, and this is something that I've heard a bit about, but I hadn't read Conceived in Liberty or anything. And I think part of my sort of adamant resistance or anything just hadn't gotten around to it. But it's like, I'm like a Spoonerite as far as like the Constitution. You know what I mean? So it's like, why should I care about the politics that went on early in U.S. history? But if nothing else, like it's just, I mean, history is just a great teacher. It's a great like reminder of even when somebody tries to come up with a nice small government, what ends up happening. But really, like what you point out, is it wasn't so much. The Constitution was more like a coup. Like they, we had the revolution. We were, for more or less, at least a bit more free. After that, and then they come in and they basically a few people in secret, do the Constitution and sort of force it upon people. But before that happened, there was a bit of British control and a lot of tariffs and import and export rules. They had like things like they weren't allowed to in various points they weren't allowed to like transfer things across state lines. They have to send it back to Britain and then back to the U.S., etc. And there were several like rebellions that went on for these things, both before and after the war and everything. And actually a couple new ones you pointed out in the book that I got to look into, like Bacon's Rebellion. I hadn't heard of that one before. Sorry, I'm trying to remember where I was going with that. Basically, like
sorry.
Go
on.
No.
I was going to say, yeah. I mean, that type. I was going to say that type of resistance is very built into American history, where since the beginning, with the English chartering the colonies and so on, that they had placed all sorts of regulations, rules regarding taxation, or you have to pay certain fees if you're shipping something outside that's not an English ship, or you can produce these goods in the colonies, you can't produce those goods, etc. But we really grew simply by avoiding those regulations. We were a nation of smugglers. We were a nation of resistors. We just ignored the regulations, or we actively resisted them, and so on. And it is fascinating to note that spirit of American resistance used to be very much alive. It still is among certain groups, but definitely less so. But we became prosperous by avoiding government laws. That's really how we became rich in the 16 and 1700s.
Yeah, that's our worldview, right? Is that we want to be prosperous. All government does is drag, they're parasites. They drag us all down. Okay. I think I was going to talk about like the rebellions and stuff. So we used to have like this, this spirit where we're willing to say, nah, fuck you. I'll pick up my gun and handle this. Now, in fairness, most of the time when there was, like these rebellions, there might have been some things that maybe weren't like, great, that they were trying to do. But, I'm always for anybody resisting an oppressive government, even if they themselves are perfect, because ultimately, like, and I'm not, I'm not saying that, a bunch of smaller governments is like perfect or anything, right? Rather than one big one. But obviously, when you have more smaller governments, things are more decentralized. You have more options. It almost turns into a market, right? Where there's like a market for government services at that point, but like you can move easily. You know what I mean? If you can like switch counties, and things can get better. And again, I'm not, our artistic audience, I don't want to get too mad at me for saying things like that, but it's almost like a market government at that point, So when when we had states that were like their own countries, you can really choose, more. But yeah, you mentioned too, like smugglers and everything, and you list a lot of acts throughout like the late 1600s, 1700s, and everything. And some of these are kind of funny. I'm going to read a couple of them. There's the Wool Act, the Hat Act, which I really like. Where I guess they had a lot of rules about buying and selling and transporting hats, which just seems hilarious to me. But it really seems like there's a lot of stuff that they tried to control. But dude, like I gotta know, like how much control do they really have over stuff back then? Like, because again, with the smugglers, like I guess if you're a big company, a big industry, just like now, it's harder to not comply because you're huge, But I mean, I just have to imagine, like, why would we pay these tariffs? I mean, wouldn't half the stuff just smuggled? And then of course, wouldn't that really give these regulations not much teeth?
Yeah, so that's one, you didn't really have large companies then. To the extent that there were large companies, they were chartered by either England or later on the American states or the federal government. And the corporation really originated as a crony institution because in order to operate a corporation or to operate using limited liability, you had to actually get a license from the government. You had to get a charter, an official charter, saying that, okay, you can make hats or you can operate a bank and so on. So that's where the public's distrust of corporations in America grew. Wasn't necessarily from the fact that they were big or it was a giant market institution. No, it's because it originated from the government. The government privileged a company over other companies, which really upset people, like the British East India Company and so on. They didn't actually, England did not actually have much control, over the American colonies in the 1600s and early 1700s. And especially in the early 1700s, this was because of the policy known as salutary neglect, which was that the British government, certain members of the British government, basically decided not to enforce various regulations because they recognized that not enforcing various regulations would actually benefit both Great Britain and the colonies.
They selectively decided, well, we won't fuck with them on that because we're just shooting ourselves in the foot. It's what's the economic term or whatever, but it's like you get to a point where you raise taxes so high you actually get less tax revenue. It almost feels kind of like that. You have too many regulations or whatever, people just go black market and you don't get any tax revenue. It's like, especially when
it's known as the Laffer curve.
That's what
known as the Laffer curve.
That's right. But I just feel like the same thing happens, with regulation too. As well, you're just going to lose that much share to black market. Which I mean, I'm not mad about, being an agorist, but it's just one of those things,
Mm-hmm.
That's funny. So what was it like? Was it just like honor system, or was it like customs or something that was responsible for making sure tariffs and stuff got paid on these items?
Well, you'd have various customs officials at ports. The issue was you could, either bribe the officials or you could just simply unload the goods on a different shore, right? You didn't actually have it at a port. You have the boat, a couple miles away from the port, the different coast, etc. And then that would get moved into the American economy. And of course, back then it was hard to monitor a lot of that stuff. So the issue was that Britain realized that they were paying for all these officials in the United States, but they weren't actually getting anything out of it. And this is particularly after the French and Indian War. They're having this huge military and everything. So they then started to increase the number of laws and regulations. But the issue is the American resistance just grew more and more vocal. And they started to basically engage in nullification, or saying, yeah, we're not going to enforce it. We're not going to comply. And this became a huge issue, a major bone of contention leading up to the American Revolution.
So we have the American Revolution, and we win, yay, or whatever. And it just like immediately a lot of you sort of get right back into a lot of status nonsense, and a lot of that comes from like ways to like pay for the revolution, well, how are we going to pay for this thing, and there's a few things that come out of that, I think that's where we have like isn't that the whiskey rebellion comes by that Shays rebellion comes out of that, where they basically write it where poor people are going to end up paying way more than the rich connected people to repay for the Revolutionary War. One thing that always confused me, and your book did a great job of explaining why it confused me, was the terms of Federalists and Anti-Federalists. And I remember arguing with a friend of mine. She's a lawyer. She's very smart, but we see very differently on politics. And she's trying to argue with me why we need a big central federal government. And she kept telling me, you have to read the Federalist Papers. You have to read the Federalist Papers. But I always thought like federalism was like more states' rights kind of thing. Why was I so confused on that?
Well, first you're correct. Federalism means states' rights. So the idea is the balance of power is preserved between the states and the federal government. So that the power of the federal government will be checked because states also have power. They can kind of sort of hold both of each other in check, or really more importantly, the states can hold the central government from encroaching on the state's prerogatives, as well as the citizens' freedoms and personal and economic liberties and so on. The term federalism got morphed by the people known as Federalists, who really should be called nationalists, just like the anti-federalists should actually be called Federalists. And they said, well, actually, screw the whole difference, the whole balance of power between the states and the federal government. The federal government can be constrained due to a balance of power within the federal government. So you just have the executive and the legislature and the judiciary. Well, they're all going to sort of constrain each other. This is the famous checks and balances that we hear so much about that supposedly stops the government from growing in size and authority. And this was argued very forcefully in the Federalist Papers. These were documents written to encourage New York to ratify the Constitution. It was written primarily by James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, with some side notes, with some additional papers written by John Jay. And the Federalist Papers, Rothbard describes them in Conceit and Liberty, they've been divinized. They're the gospel. So if you want to read how the Constitution operates, or how it's supposed to operate, or what the founding fathers said about something, well, you just go to Federalist number, insert number here, and this is what students who study history of political science are taught to believe. The issue is that the Federalist Papers, I talk about this in my book, they were really just propaganda pieces. Madison and Hamilton were going to say whatever they needed to say to convince someone to ratify, to convince people to ratify the document in New York City, to ratify the Constitution, where there was incredible resistance. So they're going to say, oh, the government is restrained, or they're not going to use this power. Hamilton argued that the federal government's not going to raise internal taxes, so taxes on land or property or on the sale of goods. They're not going to use that much. Taxes will be, quote, confined. The taxes are going to be, quote, confined within a narrow compass. So he said it. He lied, right? Because then when he was Secretary of the Treasury, he was pushing for a whiskey tax that became hated and led to the famous whiskey rebellion. So I've always been impressed by people constantly referring back to those. I would almost think Madison and Hamilton would blush if they're like, you guys are still reading that? No, those were done for a very specific purpose. They were propaganda pieces, and they totally distorted the meaning of federalism away from a states' rights approach to the famous checks and balances. As long as the three branches of government are independent, So whatever nonsense, then the power of the federal government will be constrained.
All right, let's take a quick second to shout out Agorist Acres Seeds. AgoristAcres.com stocks a variety of seeds for your garden or homestead. They also have really cool packaging instead of those silly paper envelopes.
Buy seeds with crypto, support the counter economy, and become self-sustaining today. Agorist Acres offers fast shipping so you can get started right away.
Make sure you use code Nexus10 at the checkout for 10% off of your orders. Also, they will donate a portion of the sale to Agorist Nexus, helping to bring you all the great content you expect. And all right, let's get on with it.
Now, when I was younger, I was always fascinated with the anti-federalists. Tell us how they came into play there.
Sure. So the anti-federalists in the 1780s, we had the Articles of Confederation, and there were some people, particularly various interests, bankers, manufacturers, land speculators, military officials. I go through the whole laundry list. They wanted a stronger central government. They were pushing for the Constitution. The one they were pushing for a convention to write a whole new document, the Constitutional Convention. Then they were pushing for the Constitution. They, as I mentioned, really should be called nationalists because they wanted a strong nation state, but they appropriated the term federalist. Again, this is kind of you change the meaning of words, and people are often too ignorant to understand what's going on. And then they called their opponents the anti-federalists, right? When actually the anti-federalists should really be known as the federalists, right? By the correct usage of the term. And this already put the anti-federalists at a disadvantage because no one wants to be known as anti-something. So it's like, it's just a negative Nancy at that point, right? The anti-federalists were in favor of limited government. So these were men like Virginia Governor Patrick Henry or New York Governor George Clinton. They wanted power reserved to the states. They wanted a weak central government. They also thought that the states did not need to exercise too much control over their local economies. They did think certain interventions were necessary, but that was just the sort of the spirit of the times. And they fought against the Constitution. And they said the Constitution would lead to a strong presidency, this creation of all sorts of executive branches, a strong army. It's going to lead to an American empire. The vague clauses, the necessary and proper clause, the general welfare clause are going to be used to justify whatever Congress wants to do, and so on. And they put up a good fight, and unfortunately they lost. This is quite a problem. Patrick Henry kind of retired in disgust in the 1790s. George Clinton did eventually become vice president under Jefferson and Madison, and I think his best action as vice president was being the tie-breaking vote to not renew the charter of the first Bank of the United States. So an anti-federalist killed our first central bank, which I think is great. And that the anti-federalists, they basically, once they realized the Constitution was enacted, so this is the 1790s, they realized they had lost. They can't go back to the Articles. They actually switched tactics. So then they started to strategically interpret the Constitution in a strict constructionist fashion. So arguing, oh, well, actually, the government, you can't do this. You got to interpret everything very narrowly. Congress has reserved powers. They were basically interpreting it in the way that the Federalists had promised them. So they were now turning the lie, right, using it for their own purposes, which is quite smart because, again, if you're politicians, you got to do you have to do to win. And they realized that, well, if we can't go back to the government we want, we can at least try to make this government what we want. So the libertarian or the conservative interpretation of the Constitution, as we often hear, especially by someone such as Ron Paul, who fought a good fight in Congress 10, 20 years ago, et cetera, this strict interpretation of the Constitution, this love for the Constitution or this defense of the Constitution, ironically really emerged from people who fought the Constitution, right? They realized they couldn't get what they wanted, so now they're going to try and get it through the Constitution. It's really a brilliant maneuver, and this is where our limited government meaning of the Constitution comes from. It comes from the anti-federalists.
Yeah, because otherwise it's like they were the writing of the Constitution, they had like the general welfare and I mean, they wrote it in to be able to do whatever, big government stuff they might have wanted to do in the future, eventually. So it was kind of funny reading that and thinking about, like the people who, bless them, are just like, oh, if we could just get back to the Constitution. And it's like the Constitution wasn't really what you thought it was or what you really want it to be,
Oh yeah, that's something I hope my book will kind of clarify, or people could understand, or be described in that, trying to argue whether something's constitutional or not, or the reason this is unconstitutional. That's just it means nothing. Everything can be interpreted as constitutional once you give the government the power to tax, the power to raise an army, the power to regulate. You know where it's headed, right?
Oh yeah.
What was the really unfortunate thing is, so if you actually want to limit a government, you have to limit it through what's known as structural amendments. So something like term limits, or an outright limit on how much a government can borrow, or even the ability to tax. Those aren't going to go all the way, but they're certainly going to go much farther than either personal liberty amendments, is what was in the Bill of Rights, or just a different interpretation or different spin on the government. You actually have to try to tie the government's hands behind its back in order to bring about meaningful change.
And then, of course, the obvious, continuation on that is, well, why even have one, right? But, obviously that's the fight.
Of course. Yeah.
I've been stomping all over this one. Brandon, you got anything? You got any questions or anything, dude? I'm sorry.
I've really enjoyed all of it. I want to get into Jefferson if we've got enough time. Jefferson's first term seemed really good, but then his last term just seemed, I don't know. But yeah, you would know a lot more about this subject than I would. Could you go into Jefferson for us?
Sure. So Jefferson's first term, or at least most of his first term, I would give it an A from an objective perspective, objective libertarian perspective. Is it perfect? No. Did he go as far as some of the radical supporters wanted to? No, but he kind of privatized the central bank. He cut taxes. He cut government spending. He started to pay off the debt. He mostly cut the size of the military, and all sorts of other stuff. So that he reformed the judiciary, repealed the Judiciary Act of 1801. The good stuff, right? The beggars can't be choosers. I'll take that presidency any day of the week. The issue was in his first term. It's the end of his first term. He also engaged in what, unfortunately, many people would consider the best action of his presidency, which was the Louisiana Purchase, which was buying a massive amount of land, what was called Louisiana back then, French Louisiana, basically from the modern state of Louisiana all the way up to Montana for basically a rough overview, a rough outline of the territory we're talking about, from France. I think it was for a bargain, $15 million. And the issue is, well, nowhere in the Constitution, and according to Jefferson's strict constructionist view, does the Constitution permit governments, the U.S. government, from buying land from another country. So if, as a strict constructionist, you wanted to do this, you would have to pass an amendment, right? But Jefferson didn't do that. He toyed with the idea, but he said, no, we're just gonna buy it now. And once you did that, well, then the whole sort of strict constructionist view more or less collapsed, because you've untied the hands behind the government's back. Now they're just going to do whatever they want, right? So Pandora's box has been opened. So Jefferson doing this, not only did it increase the national debt, it exploded the size of the country. And it really made it into an empire. You got to imagine, you can look at the picture online, the size of the land purchased, it was massive. So Jefferson always wanted what he called an empire of liberty, which was actually pretty good. His original conception was several confederacies across the continental United States, linked with the decentralized governments and states. They would all be linked together through common cultural norms in the English language, etc. So Jefferson always thought the West Coast would be its own country. which is something I really hope we could create at some point in time. And that's what he wanted, but it slowly became kind of this empire of power, because once he purchased Louisiana, everything fell apart in his second term. He started to grant bailouts to land speculators, particularly these New England land speculators, to prevent New England from seceding because they were upset over the Louisiana Purchase. He started to acquire, he wanted to try and acquire Florida from Spain, aggressively acquire Florida from Spain. And this was because, well, now the empire is bigger, you got to protect its southern border. He supported internal improvements, so the government building roads and all sorts of other infrastructure in order to bind the West to the East. So you have all this new land in the West, but you got to protect it. You got to build roads and all of that stuff. He started to support tariffs and other sorts of privileges for manufacturers and shippers. And he also started to move to conquering Canada in the north, right? Again, if you got to protect the empire in the north, you got to just add more land. And that just, the empire grows bigger and bigger. So really, the Embargo Act, which was a draconian attempt, we cut off all trade with Great Britain to try and get them to stop impressing our soldiers. So we're saying no more American ships will be able to import or export goods. So it was like a lockdown in the Jeffersonian era. It was extremely harmful for economic activity. He said it was an alternative to war, but at the same time, he was also moving to try and attack Canada, because that was always his goal, invade Canada. So really, like, his second term just gets an absolute F. And it's really unfortunate because power corrupted Jefferson. This is a theme I have in my book. It's that power incentivizes cronyism, and Jefferson, unfortunately, was human like the rest of us.
He also Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was say he also was for sending like the military to like the Mediterranean there were some of the countries there were looking for tribute if we wanted to trade, through the Mediterranean, I believe is what it was, and he was actually for sending the Navy there instead of just paying, which would typically be cheaper than war. So that was a little bit surprising too when I read that.
Yeah, the Barbary pirates, particularly at Tripoli. So he sent troops there, and part of that was, one, he wanted to try and cater to the Federalists. They're very big in the naval community, so sort of enlist them into his Republican Party. And yeah, that happened in his first term. It sort of slowed down the overall decline in military spending, which still occurred, but it was the same sort of pressure that Jefferson faced. And this is just, he tried to straddle between the radicals and the moderates, and he sided with the moderates, and it kind of bit him in the ass.
Way it goes. Seems to be. We probably wrap this up here in a few minutes. Did you have anything else, Brandon? Do you have any other questions or anything?
Yeah, so many, but I don't think we've got time to get into it all. But what a great perspective on Jefferson. He kind of gave me a great overview, and I will be checking out your book for sure. But again, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on. I know I've been kind of a quiet player in this, but yeah, it's been, definitely a great listen. So thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. I'm glad you like my interpretation of Jefferson. I'm very happy you'll be reading the book, and I'm happy to be on. It's a pleasure.
Dude, so I do this a lot of times when I have somebody on talk about a book or whatever. I get, I'm 2 pages in the book, and I have 3 pages of notes, and I'm like, this is going to be a 14-hour podcast if I keep this up, a question, every paragraph, I've got a question. So I always have to okay, tone it down, but yeah, man, thanks a lot for coming on. So as far as the book goes, it's not officially out yet. Where can people find it? Where should people expect it, or when? And give us the rundown there.
Sure. So right now there's a pre-order page on Mises.org. So if you go to the Mises store and you type in Patrick Newman Cronyism, you get a pre-order page. You could have it be autographed by me if you would like. The book will start to ship out November 1st. The book will be released at the Mises Institute Supporters Summit. At least that's the official unveiling. This is in October, so October 21st to 23rd. Starting in November, you will be able to purchase the book on Amazon, where a lot of books are bought through Mises traditionally, as well as other outlets. The reason it's just not up yet, just simply because they're doing a print on demand for that. So, but you can get you can order it, pre-order it right now on the Mises website. You can order it on Amazon in November, and it'll basically be available there. So it's a Mises Institute product, and you can find it on their website.
Excellent. I'd like to say a couple things about it real quick. One, it's a very nice read. It's this. I hate when I say it like it's easy to read. It makes it sound like dumbed down. That's not the case. I'm not saying that, but it's easy to read. It's easy to comprehend. I really like how you like at the end of a section. You know, you do a little bit of like reiteration. You know, like okay, here's a couple main like points and takeaways, and I like that. I feel like it really helps me comprehend and remember, you know, all the stuff I'm reading. So it makes the best of my time. I think it'd make a great audiobook. Are there any plans for doing like an audiobook?
Yes, there are. I know we wanted to do an audiobook. I was speaking to the Mises Institute in the summer about that. I don't know if they've chosen someone yet. Originally, someone thought I should do the audiobook, but I think my quick New Jersey accent would very rapidly bore readers. So I think we're going to get someone with a much more beautiful voice.
Some people are just great at it. I just recently got into audiobooks, and I just got been driving a lot for work, and now I'm hooked because, like, yeah, I'm just tearing through them on the road, you know. But yeah, man, having somebody with just like a good voice definitely makes all the difference for sure. Cool.
Yeah, well, I agree.
Well, Patrick, dude, this has been great. Thank you so much for coming on. We will get all your links up on the show notes page. Definitely, everybody, go check this one out. It's really awesome. And again, man, thank you for your service with both this book and getting those Rothbard books out there. I love the Progressive Era.
All right. Well, glad to hear it. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So we usually close out with a quote. I don't know if you had one, Brandon. Otherwise, I have one I would like to read. Hopefully Patrick doesn't mind. I cannot accept your canon that we are to judge Pope and King unlike other men with a favorable presumption that they did no wrong. If there is any presumption, it is the other way, against holders of power, increasing as the power increases. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. It's Lord Acton, 1887, and that is from the beginning of Cronyism. So definitely a little bit of a theme throughout the book there.
Just end it there then.
All right, sounds good to me.
Agorist Acres is out.
Peace.
Yeah.